The world in the early 15th century was a patchwork of civilizations, largely unaware of each other. In China, the Ming dynasty looked inward. In the Americas, the Aztec and Inca empires flourished, isolated from the rest of humanity. Europe was a continent on the edge, filled with a restless energy, yet a change was coming, driven by ambition, technology, and curiosity. The fall of Constantinople severed trade routes to the east. This created an incentive to find a sea route to India and Cathay. So the stage was set for a new chapter in human history, the Age of Discovery. It started with small steps, with determined sailors pushing into the Atlantic. Imagine a map from the year 1450. It would look strange to our modern eyes. Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East would be recognizable. But the world would begin to dissolve into guesswork and fantasy. The Americas, Australia, and Antarctica were completely absent. This was the world as they knew it, based on limited information. The great oceans were the world's effective boundaries. To sail west into the open Atlantic was considered madness. Many maps were less concerned with geographical accuracy than with theological storytelling. Portolan charts were remarkably precise in their depiction of coastlines. The challenge was to replace the monsters and myths with real land and real sea. The voyages of discovery would shatter this separation. They would stitch the continents together into a single, interconnected global system. The blank spaces on the map were about to be filled in. For centuries, the East captivated Europe with immense wealth, ancient wisdom, and exotic wonders. Spices were worth more than gold, symbols of status and medicine. Silk from China clothed kings. The journey was long, passing through Venice or Genoa. Beyond goods, the East was a land of stories, like Marco Polo's tales. This desire for wealth and curiosity created an obsession with finding a direct route, bypassing middlemen to tap into the Indies' wealth. The nation controlling this route would become the most powerful in Europe. Kingdoms invested fortunes, sailors risked lives, pursuing spice, silk, and the East's golden promise. Dreams of discovery needed the right tools. The Great Leap into the ocean required a new ship. The caravel was revolutionary, small, fast, and agile. It was the workhorse of the early age of discovery, strong enough to withstand storms and explore shallow waters. It was the key that would unlock the oceans. Without it, the voyages of Diaz, da Gama, and Columbus would have been impossible. The answer was found in the sky. New instruments made celestial observations more accurate. However, one great navigational problem remained unsolved: longitude. This uncertainty meant that every voyage into the unknown was a tremendous gamble. Technology and economics set the stage, but the age of discovery was propelled by individuals, men of fierce ambition. They were entrepreneurs, visionaries, and gamblers, often from the margins of society seeking glory and wealth. Faith was another motivator, intertwined with riches. The promise of fortune was a tangible driver. For monarchs, it meant national power. These forces, ambition, faith, and fortune, created a potent cocktail, inspiring courage and justifying exploitation. The story of exploration is a complex human drama played out on a global stage. The first sustained push into the unknown Atlantic came from Portugal. Prince Henry, the navigator, became the visionary patron of this effort, establishing a navigation center at Sagres. His goal: to explore the coast of Africa, driven by crusading zeal and the lure of West African gold. Portuguese caravels crept further south, charting the coastline and overcoming old fears. They learned the Volta do Mar, a revolutionary sailing technique. These voyages were the first heartbeats of the Age of Discovery, building the ships and training the navigators. They demonstrated that the open ocean could be mastered and the unknown mapped. These stirrings off Africa were the beginning of a process that would alter human history. The Age of Discovery begins with Prince Henry of Portugal. He earned the title, the Navigator, for his patronage of exploration. From his base in the Algarve, Henry orchestrated the first systematic effort to conquer the Atlantic's mysteries. He saw the sea as a pathway to Portuguese power. Henry's vision was a blend of medieval crusading zeal and Renaissance curiosity. He sought to intercept the gold and resources flowing across the Sahara. For decades, Henry funded expeditions, sending caravels down the West African coast. He gathered cartographers and instrument makers to solve navigation problems. Henry created a culture of exploration, transforming discovery into a state-sponsored science. This set in motion events that led Portugal to Africa, India, and a changed world map. On the windswept promontory of Sagres, the southwesternmost point of Portugal and of mainland Europe, Prince Henry established his legendary center for navigation. This was not a formal university in the modern sense, but rather a dynamic community of experts, a sort of think tank for the sea. Henry brought together the best minds he could find, seasoned Italian sea captains, Jewish cartographers with access to ancient maps, Arab astronomers who understood the stars, and Portuguese shipbuilders who were perfecting the design of the caravel. It was here, at the very edge of the known world, that the knowledge needed to explore the unknown was systematically gathered, refined, and put into practice. The work at Sagres was intensely practical. Mapmakers were constantly at work, updating their charts with the latest information brought back by returning captains. Every new river mouth, every cape, every subtle change in the coastline was meticulously recorded. This created an ever-improving proprietary set of maps that gave Portuguese sailors a significant advantage over their rivals. Astronomers worked to adapt complex instruments like the astrolabe and quadrant for the difficult conditions of a moving ship, teaching navigators how to determine their latitude from the sun and stars, a skill absolutely essential for knowing how far south they had traveled along the African coast. This school was also a place where theory met reality. The knowledge developed was not merely academic, it was immediately tested in the crucible of the Atlantic. Captains would depart from the nearby port of Lagos with the latest charts and techniques, and upon their return, their real-world experiences would be used to correct and improve the theories. It was an iterative process, a feedback loop of exploration and innovation. The sailors learned from the scholars and the scholars learned from the sailors. This unique collaboration between the thinker and the doer was one of the key secrets to Portugal's early success, turning raw courage into calculated, repeatable progress. The legacy of Sagres is honestly immeasurable. It created a body of knowledge and a cadre of skilled professionals that formed the backbone of Portuguese exploration for a century. The information compiled there was guarded as a state secret, a vital national asset in the growing competition between European powers. While the physical existence of a formal school is debated by some historians, the reality of Henry's project is undeniable. He fostered an environment where the science of the sea could flourish, transforming navigation from a dark art into a systematic discipline. This crucible of knowledge gave his sailors the confidence and the tools to push past the limits of their world. For early 15th century sailors, the world had a very real edge: Cape Boyador. Located on the coast of Western Sahara, it was the southernmost point known to European mariners. Beyond it, legend reigned. For years, this psychological barrier proved formidable. Prince Henry understood this fear had to be broken. The breakthrough came in 1434 thanks to Gil Eanes. On his second voyage, Eanes sailed far west, avoiding coastal currents. He found calm waters beyond the Cape. The world changed. The psychological barrier was shattered. With courage, the impossible could be achieved. Eanes's voyage opened the door to Africa. Once the barrier of Cape Boyador was broken, the pace of Portuguese exploration quickened dramatically. The door to West Africa was now wide open, and what the explorers found there was not the empty desert they had first encountered, but a land teeming with life and, most importantly, with opportunities for trade. By the 1440s, Portuguese caravels had reached the coasts of what we now call Senegal and Gambia. Here, for the first time, they came into direct contact with the sub-Saharan African peoples and the riches that Henry had long sought. The mythical river of gold was not found, but a vibrant coastal trade began to develop. The first commodity the Portuguese sought was gold. They established trading posts, or feitorias, along the coast, small fortified settlements where they could conduct business in relative safety. They traded European goods like cloth, brassware and horses for the gold dust that was brought to the coast by local merchants. This new source of wealth began to flow directly into Lisbon's coffers, funding further voyages and cementing the value of Henry's project. But another far more sinister trade also began, one that would cast a long and dark shadow over the entire age of discovery and its legacy. This was the trade in human beings. The first African captives were brought to Portugal in 1441, presented to Prince Henry as exotic curiosities from a newly discovered land. Initially, the voyages were framed as raids, a continuation of the crusade against the Moors, but it did not take long for raiding to give way to a more organized and, unfortunately, profitable trade. Portuguese captains found it was far easier and more efficient to buy enslaved people from African traders and chiefs, who often sold captives from rival tribes or those taken in local wars. A market was established in Lagos, and the tragic transatlantic slave trade had its small, grim beginnings on these very shores. Thus, the legacy of these early voyages became deeply complicated. On one hand, they were triumphs of navigation and courage, expanding Europe's knowledge of the world and bringing new wealth to the Portuguese kingdom. The region soon became known to Europeans as the Gold Coast, a name that spoke to its economic importance. On the other hand, they initiated a brutal system of exploitation, treating human beings as just another commodity to be bought and sold. This dual legacy of brilliant achievement and profound human tragedy would become a defining characteristic of the entire era, a story of connection and commerce intertwined with conquest and suffering. Portuguese ships faced a challenge returning north against prevailing winds. Early voyages involved tacking, a slow process. The solution was the volta do mar, a revolutionary sailing strategy. Instead of hugging the coast, captains sailed far northwest into the Atlantic. This allowed them to catch westerly winds for a faster return to Portugal. Mastering this technique transformed the Atlantic into an open highway. The volta do mar was key to long-distance voyages, enabling explorers like Dias, da Gama, and Columbus. After Prince Henry's death, Portuguese exploration slowed. Ferdinand Gomes leased the rights to African trade, exploring new coastline each year. Under Gomes, the African coast was systematically charted. They crossed the equator, disproving myths, and developed new celestial navigation techniques. The coast turned east, then south again, revealing lands rich in gold, ivory, and pepper. They established Elmina Castle, symbolizing Portugal's presence. By King John II's reign, the map of Africa had vastly changed. The Portuguese became the most experienced mariners, mastering navigation. All that remained was finding the route to India. King John II revived Prince Henry's quest to find a sea route to the Indies. He chose Bartolomeu Dias to lead the expedition. In 1487, Dias set out from Lisbon to find the end of Africa. A storm blew them far south for 13 days. Dias turned north and found a new coastline, realizing they'd rounded the tip. They had sailed into the Indian Ocean. The crew forced Dias to turn back. He named it the Cape of Storms. Upon returning to Lisbon, King John renamed it the Cape of Good Hope. The Cape of Good Hope discovery was a triumph for Portugal, opening a path to India. Yet a decade passed before the next voyage. King John II, a cautious planner, sought more intelligence and dispatched spies. Then Columbus's voyage created a crisis. Diplomatic negotiations led to the Treaty of Tordesillas, dividing the world between Spain and Portugal. The India project was sidelined. The mission remained unfinished, awaiting the right moment to complete Prince Henry's vision. By 1495, King John II was dead, and King Manuel I inherited the throne. Determined to see the India project through, he prepared a powerful fleet. Larger ships were built, armed with heavy cannon for trade, diplomacy, and force if needed. Vasco da Gama, known for being tough, was chosen to lead. On July 8, 1497, da Gama's fleet departed from Lisbon. The ships carried provisions, stone pillars to claim land, and letters to eastern rulers. Da Gama sailed far into the South Atlantic, avoiding unfavorable winds, making a direct course for the Cape of Good Hope. The push to India had begun. After rounding the Cape of Good Hope, Vasco da Gama's fleet entered the Indian Ocean. This ocean had been a bustling center of commerce. Da Gama was breaking into a trading system dominated by Muslim merchants. In Malindi, he hired an expert pilot. In 1498, they reached Calicut, a key trading hub. The Zamorin of Calicut was unimpressed with da Gama's goods, and the Arab merchants were hostile. Da Gama acquired spices, proving the route's profitability. They brought back spices and knowledge that the sea route to India was real. The world had fundamentally changed. While Portugal charted the African coast, Spain was preoccupied with unifying the kingdom through the Reconquista. This defined Spanish identity, focusing resources on reclaiming the peninsula. In 1492, Granada fell, completing the Reconquista. Spain, unified and filled with purpose, looked outwards, ready to compete with Portugal. The lure of the Indies was potent, and the Hidalgos sought new ambitions. Spain needed a plan to bypass Portugal's route to Asia. A Genoese navigator found a receptive audience for his radical proposal. Christopher Columbus, born in Genoa, was a man of immense ambition and unshakable self-belief. He believed the riches of the East Indies could be reached by sailing west across the Atlantic. Columbus underestimated the Earth's circumference and overestimated Asia's eastward extension. For years, Columbus peddled his plan to European royal courts, receiving refusals. Yet Columbus persisted with a conviction that bordered on fanaticism, driven by a divine mission. It was this combination of flawed science, ambition, and zeal that kept his dream alive. For years, Christopher Columbus sought backing from Ferdinand and Isabella. Royal commissions deemed his calculations optimistic and demands exorbitant. Dejected, Columbus prepared to leave Spain. Luis de Santangel, keeper of the royal purse, saw potential in Columbus's idea. He convinced Queen Isabella to gamble on the voyage. Messengers intercepted Columbus. He would be admiral, viceroy, and governor-general, receiving 10% of riches found. After years, the stubborn sailor had his chance. The Queen's gamble was on. Columbus traveled to Palos de la Frontera to assemble his fleet. It was a scrappy, hastily organized affair. His fleet consisted of 3 small vessels, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Nina. The crew numbered around 90 men. They loaded the ships with provisions and trinkets for trade. On August 3, 1492, under a clear sky, the fleet departed. Columbus was convinced he was sailing towards Asia. After stopping in the Canary Islands, Columbus's fleet sailed into the unknown on September 6, 1492. As the days passed, anxiety grew among the crew. Columbus, aware of their fear, kept 2 logs, one falsified to show the crew. He reassured them with false signs of land, but as October arrived, morale plummeted. Facing potential mutiny, Columbus negotiated, promising riches, and reminding them of the Queen's authority. He asked for 3 more days, a desperate gamble against the vast ocean. After days of tension, hope, and skepticism, signs of land appeared. Land was undeniably close, and energy surged through the fleet. On October 12, 1492, a lookout spotted a pale strip of sand glistening in the moonlight. Land. As dawn broke, the Europeans saw a lush green island. They had stumbled upon a tranquil shore in what would later be known as the Bahamas. Columbus named the island San Salvador, thanking God. He claimed the island for Spain, as the inhabitants watched. The 2 halves of the world had finally met. As Columbus and his men performed their ceremony on the beach, the island's native people emerged from the trees. These were the Taino, a peaceful people who inhabited the islands of the Greater Antilles. They were, in Columbus's words, very well built, with very handsome bodies and very good faces. The Taino approached the strange, pale, bearded men with caution and curiosity. They had never seen such people, nor ships like the ones floating in the bay, which they may have imagined were great sea creatures. They were naked, adorned with simple ornaments, and carried no weapons, save for small wooden spears. Their initial reaction was one of gentle, timid wonder. Columbus, for his part, saw the Taino through the lens of his own ambitions and preconceptions. He noted their peaceful nature and lack of iron weapons, immediately concluding they would be easy to subdue and convert to Christianity. He wrote in his journal that they should be good servants and intelligent, and I believe that they would easily be made Christians because it seemed to me that they had no religion. From the very first moments of contact, a profound and tragic misunderstanding was set in motion. The Europeans saw potential servants and converts. The Taino saw strange visitors who, for a time, they may have believed were beings from the sky. The first interactions were centered around trade. Columbus and his men offered the Taino cheap trinkets, glass beads, brass hawks' bells, and red caps. To the Europeans, these items were worthless. To the Taino, who had never seen worked glass or metal, they were wondrous and magical. In exchange, the Taino offered what they had: parrots, balls of cotton thread, and small ornaments of hammered gold that they wore in their noses. It was this gold, however small in quantity, that electrified Columbus and his crew. It was the proof they needed that they had indeed reached the Indies, a land of riches. This initial encounter planted the seeds of everything that was to follow. There was a moment of genuine wonder and peaceful curiosity on both sides. But, it was overshadowed by the vast cultural chasm and the fundamentally unequal power dynamic that was being established. The European desire for gold, their assumption of religious and cultural superiority, and their view of the native people as a resource to be exploited were present from the very beginning. The friendly exchanges on the beach of San Salvador were the gentle prelude to a collision of worlds that would have devastating consequences for the Taino and all the indigenous peoples of the Americas. After landing on San Salvador, Columbus sought the source of gold in the cities of the Great Khan. The Taino spoke of Colba, now Cuba, where he hoped to find golden palaces. For 3 months, Columbus explored the Bahamas, Cuba, and Hispaniola, interpreting everything through his distorted lens of finding Asia. He found villages and people smoking tobacco. The quest for gold became an obsession. He sailed to Hispaniola, where gold seemed more promising, recognizing its strategic value as a future colony. The dream of discovery transformed into a plan for settlement and conquest. On Christmas Eve, 1492, the Santa Maria ran aground off Hispaniola. The ship was lost. Columbus decided to build a fort from the wreckage, La Navidad, leaving some men behind to search for gold. Martin Alonso Pinzon rejoined Columbus, and they began the difficult return to Spain. Fierce storms separated the ships. The Nina finally made landfall in the Azores before continuing to Spain. The discovery was yet to be announced. In early March of 1493, after more than 7 months away, Christopher Columbus sailed his battered caravel, the Nina, into the Tagus River and the port of Lisbon. It was, an ironic twist of fate that he first had to report his success to the very king who had rejected his plan years earlier. King John II of Portugal listened to Columbus's incredible story with alarm, realizing that Spain may have beaten him to the Indies after all. A few days later, Columbus finally sailed into the Spanish port of Palos, the same harbor he had departed from in near obscurity. In a stunning coincidence, Martin Alonso Pinzon and the Pinta sailed into a nearby port on the very same day, having survived the storm. Columbus's arrival in Spain set off a wave of excitement across the country and, honestly, all of Europe. He was no longer a scorned petitioner but a national hero. He traveled overland to Barcelona to report to Ferdinand and Isabella, his journey turning into a kind of victory parade. He brought with him the proof of his discovery, a collection of colorful parrots, strange plants like tobacco and maize, and most importantly, several captive Taino people adorned with golden ornaments. He presented these wonders to the monarchs in a lavish court reception, describing the islands he had found as an earthly paradise, ripe for exploitation and full of promise. This moment marked the beginning of something far more significant than a new trade route. It initiated the Columbian Exchange, the vast and unprecedented transfer of plants, animals, cultures, technologies, ideas, and tragically, diseases between the eastern and western hemispheres. From the Americas, Europe would gain transformative crops like potatoes, maize, tomatoes, and chocolate, which would revolutionize diets and spur population growth. From Europe, the Americas would receive wheat, sugarcane, horses, cattle, and pigs. This exchange would, without a doubt, irrevocably alter the ecology and societies of both worlds. But the exchange also had a devastatingly dark side. The Europeans unknowingly brought with them diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza, to which the indigenous peoples of the Americas had no immunity. These pathogens would sweep through the continents in the coming decades, causing catastrophic population collapses on a scale never before seen in human history. Columbus's triumphant return, celebrated as the dawn of a new age of opportunity for Europe, was also the beginning of a profound tragedy for the peoples of the New World. The two worlds were now connected, for better and for worse, and neither would ever be the same again. Columbus's discoveries gifted Spain a new world, stunning its rivals. The Treaty of Tordesillas divided the world between Spain and Portugal. But a key question remained: where did the Spice Islands fall? Portugal, with a head start via Africa, reached the Spice Islands by 1512, reaping huge profits. Spain, blocked by the Americas, sought a westward passage to challenge Portugal's claim and control of the spice trade. While gold trickled into Spanish coffers, the true engine of the global economy was spice. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg were fantastically valuable, worth more than gold in Europe. The most valuable spices came from the Molucca and Banda Islands. The Portuguese aimed to create an absolute monopoly, controlling local sultans and trade. For Spain, finding the Spice Islands became an obsession. Balboa's discovery of the Pacific confirmed a sea passage was the only option. The fate of empires hung on finding this elusive channel. The race was on to unlock the Pacific and the riches of the East. Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese nobleman and experienced mariner, veteran of campaigns in India, sought to prove the Spice Islands lay within Spanish territory. Frustrated by King Manuel's rejection, Magellan proposed a westward route to the Spice Islands to the young Spanish King Charles. Magellan's timing was perfect. He promised a westward passage, Spanish ownership of the islands, and a profitable spice cargo. Captivated, King Charles funded Magellan's expedition, making the Portuguese outcast captain general of a new Spanish armada. Magellan's Armada de Molucca consisted of 5 ships, including the Trinidad, San Antonio, and Victoria. They were packed with supplies for 2 years at sea, including hardtack, wine, and trade goods. The expedition's international crew was a source of tension, with Magellan, a Portuguese captain general, viewed with suspicion. In September 1519, the fleet departed, sailing into the Atlantic. Magellan kept his route secret, fueling paranoia among his captains. After crossing the Atlantic, they began the difficult search for the strait, sailing along the desolate coast of South America. As the brutal southern winter closed in, Magellan's fleet was battered by storms and forced to camp at Port St. Julian. The Spanish captains, convinced Magellan was leading them to ruin, seized 3 ships and launched a mutiny. Magellan, outnumbered, responded with cunning. His men assassinated the mutiny leader Mendoza and retook the Victoria. The remaining rebels surrendered. Magellan's swift, ruthless justice followed, executions, maroonings, and pardons only for those he needed. The rebellion crushed, Magellan's authority was absolute and terrifying. The fleet, battered but united, braced for the unknown ahead. The Strait, and the Pacific, still waited to be found. After a brutal winter, Magellan's reduced fleet resumed its search and discovered a twisting, perilous channel, the Strait of Magellan. For 38 days they battled storms and treacherous currents, losing the San Antonio to desertion. Fires on the southern shore inspired the name Tierra del Fuego. At last, the battered ships emerged into a vast, calm ocean. The sailors wept with relief. Magellan named it the Pacific. The passage to Asia was real. But the hardest journey was just beginning. The world had grown larger and far more dangerous. The Pacific crossing became a nightmare. 99 days of starvation, disease, and death. The crew ate sawdust, leather, and maggot-ridden biscuits. Scurvy ravaged their bodies. 19 men died, their bodies lost to the endless sea. At last land appeared, Guam, where a violent encounter brought brief respite. The survivors had crossed the world's greatest ocean, but their ordeal was far from over. Asia and the Spice Islands were finally within reach. The cost of survival was written in suffering. In the Philippines, Magellan shifted from explorer to would-be conqueror, forging alliances and baptizing thousands. Drawn into local conflict, he led a doomed attack on Lapu-Lapu of Mactan. Outnumbered and trapped, Magellan was killed, brought down by his own arrogance and a poisoned arrow. His men, leaderless and shocked, fled, leaving their captain's body behind. The expedition's fate now hung by a thread. The dream of circumnavigation would depend on those who survived. Magellan's ambition had cost him everything. With Magellan dead, chaos reigned. Alliances shattered and the crew was decimated. Forced to burn a ship, the survivors elected Elcano as captain. They reached the Spice Islands, loaded precious cloves, and split up to escape the Portuguese. The Trinidad was captured. The Victoria under Elcano risked a southern route home. Scurvy, storms, and pursuit thinned their ranks. Desperate, they fled the Cape Verde Islands, leaving men behind. The Victoria limped toward Spain, a ghost ship crewed by the last survivors. The final leg was a race against death. On September 6, 1522, the Victoria staggered into Spain. Only 18 survivors remained. Their cargo of cloves paid for the entire voyage. Their story stunned Europe. Elcano was hailed as a hero, the first to circumnavigate the globe. The voyage proved the world's roundness and revealed the vastness of the Pacific. The crew's lost day confirmed the reality of global time differences. Magellan's vision, completed by Elcano, changed humanity's understanding of the planet. The world was now, undeniably, one. The voyages of Columbus and the circumnavigation of Magellan's fleet had redrawn the map of the world. They proved that new continents existed and that the entire globe was navigable. This first wave of discovery, driven by the search for sea routes and spices, had been the work of sailors and navigators. But now, a new chapter was beginning. The primary motive was shifting from finding a path to the east to exploiting the lands of the newly discovered west. The era of the explorer was giving way to the era of the conqueror. The goal was no longer just to chart coastlines but to march inland, to claim territory, and to seize the immense wealth these new lands were rumored to hold. This second wave was dominated by Spain, which had been granted dominion over most of the Americas by the Treaty of Tordesillas. Having established footholds in the Caribbean islands like Hispaniola and Cuba, the Spanish began to hear tantalizing stories from the native peoples. These were tales of vast, wealthy empires on the mainland, civilizations with great cities, powerful armies, and most importantly, staggering quantities of gold and silver. For the Spanish colonists, many of whom were soldiers who had fought in the Reconquista, these rumors were an irresistible call to action, promising glory and riches beyond their wildest dreams. The nature of the expeditions changed dramatically. The ships were no longer just carrying sailors and supplies, they were transporting soldiers, horses, and weapons of war. The leaders of these ventures were not just sea captains, but military commanders. They were entrepreneurs of violence, often funding their own expeditions in the hope of winning a massive return on their investment. They operated with a royal license, but with a great deal of autonomy, making life and death decisions far from any oversight from the Spanish crown. This was a new, more aggressive phase of European expansion, one that would be defined by military campaigns, not nautical charts. This transition from exploration to conquest would lead to one of the most dramatic and tragic collisions of cultures in human history. The Spanish, with their steel swords, firearms, and horses, possessed a military technology that was utterly alien to the indigenous peoples of the Americas. They also carried an unshakable belief in their own cultural and religious superiority, viewing the native civilizations as idolatrous and ripe for subjugation. The stage was set for a series of incredibly audacious, brutal, and transformative campaigns that would see a few hundred determined adventurers bring down empires that had flourished for centuries. The men who led these new campaigns were a unique product of their time and place. They were the conquistadors, a term that translates simply as conquerors. They were typically men of minor nobility, hidalgos from the poorer regions of Spain like Extremadura. They possessed immense ambition but limited prospects at home. Hardened by the long wars of the Reconquista, they were accustomed to hardship, violence, and taking great risks for personal gain. They saw the New World not as a place to settle peacefully, but as a battlefield where they could win the fortune and fame that was denied to them in the rigid society of Spain. Their motivations were a potent and inseparable blend of gold, God, and glory. The pursuit of gold was the most immediate and powerful driver. They dreamed of finding legendary treasures, the mythical city of El Dorado, and returning to Spain as fantastically wealthy men. Yet they also saw themselves as agents of God, carrying the banner of the Catholic faith into pagan lands. They believed it was their sacred duty to overthrow native religions, which they saw as demonic, and to bring the indigenous peoples into the fold of Christianity by persuasion if possible, by force if necessary. This religious certainty provided a powerful justification for their often brutal actions. Glory was the third pillar of their ambition. In the culture of 16th century Spain, honor and reputation were paramount. A successful conquistador could earn a title, a coat of arms, and a legendary name that would be remembered for generations. They read chivalric romances, tales of heroic knights performing great deeds, and saw themselves as the heroes of a new real-life epic. They were driven by a desire to perform acts of incredible daring, to overcome impossible odds, and to have their feats immortalized. This thirst for personal glory made them incredibly bold and often incredibly reckless in their pursuit of conquest. The conquistador was therefore a complex figure, part soldier, part entrepreneur, part missionary, and part explorer. They were disciplined in battle but often insubordinate to authority. They were capable of enduring unimaginable hardships and of inflicting unimaginable cruelty. They were men of deep faith who committed acts of appalling greed and violence. Men like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro were the archetypes of this new breed of leader. They were not just following orders, they were shaping empires, toppling civilizations, and changing the course of history through sheer force of will. From the Spanish base in Cuba, Governor Diego Velázquez had sent several small expeditions to explore the nearby mainland. They returned with intriguing artifacts and stories of a powerful, wealthy civilization in the interior. In 1519, Velázquez organized a larger expedition to trade with and investigate this land, which the Spanish called Mexico. To lead it, he chose an ambitious and charismatic 34-year-old official from Extremadura named Hernán Cortés. Cortés had been in the New World for years, gaining wealth and experience, but he was hungry for more. He threw himself into preparing the expedition with an energy that began to worry the governor. Cortés invested his own fortune and went into debt to assemble a formidable force. He recruited about 500 soldiers, 100 sailors, 16 horses, and a small number of cannons and firearms. His charisma and grand promises attracted many veterans and adventurers eager for action. Governor Velázquez, seeing the scale of the preparations and hearing rumors of Cortés's ambition, grew suspicious. He feared Cortés was planning not a trading mission, but a full-blown campaign of conquest that he would lead for his own glory, cutting the governor out of the riches. Just as Cortés was about to depart, Velázquez sent orders revoking his command. Cortés, having invested everything he had, was not about to be stopped. In a bold act of mutiny, he defied the governor's orders and hastily set sail from Cuba before he could be officially removed. He had effectively become an outlaw, gambling his entire future on the success of his unauthorized mission. He knew that the only way to escape punishment for his insubordination was to win a victory so great and to secure a treasure so vast for the Spanish crown that his disobedience would be forgiven. From that moment on, there was no turning back. He had committed himself to a path of conquest. Upon landing on the coast of Mexico, Cortés took another audacious step to ensure his men's loyalty and eliminate any thought of retreat. After establishing a town, Veracruz, and a legal framework that notionally transferred his allegiance from Governor Velázquez directly to King Charles I of Spain, he gave a dramatic order. He had his own ships intentionally sunk or scuttled. The message to his men was clear and terrifying. There would be no return to Cuba. Their only path was forward, inland, to confront the mighty Aztec Empire. They would either conquer or die. Cortés marched inland towards the Aztec Empire, exploiting political divisions and allying with the Tlaxcalans. Montezuma, the Aztec emperor, received news of the Spanish with uncertainty and chose diplomacy, sending gifts of gold, which only fueled Spanish desire. In 1519, the Spanish arrived at Tenochtitlan, a metropolis of over 200,000 people. Montezuma welcomed Cortés peacefully, housing them in a palace. Cortés, aware of his position, took Montezuma hostage, ruling the empire through him. For months, Cortés ruled the Aztec Empire through Montezuma, but the situation was a powder keg. When Cortés left the city, Alvarado's brutal decision to attack unarmed Aztec nobles ignited the city's fury. The people rose up against the Spanish. Upon Cortés's return, he walked into a trap. Montezuma was killed by his own people, and Cortés's only option was escape. On La Noche Triste, the Spanish and their allies fled. Discovered, they were swarmed by Aztec warriors, resulting in a bloody rout and devastating defeat. Battered and broken, Hernán Cortés and the few survivors of the Noche Triste limped back to the safety of their Tlaxcalan allies. Any ordinary leader would have admitted defeat and returned to the coast. But Cortés was no ordinary leader. His will was unbreakable. He refused to abandon his quest. Instead, he spent the next year methodically planning his revenge and the final conquest of the Aztec Empire. He knew he could not take the island city of Tenochtitlan by force from the causeways alone. He needed to control the lake, so he ordered the construction of a fleet of 13 small prefabricated warships, which could be carried in pieces over the mountains and assembled on the shores of Lake Texcoco. While Cortés rebuilt his army, an invisible and far more deadly ally was at work. A Spanish soldier had unknowingly brought smallpox to the mainland. The disease, to which the Europeans had developed immunity over centuries, was completely new to the Americas. It swept through the Aztec population with devastating speed and lethality. It killed hundreds of thousands, including the new Aztec emperor who had succeeded Montezuma, leaving the empire weakened, demoralized, and in a state of chaos. The epidemic created a demographic catastrophe that crippled the Aztec ability to resist the coming Spanish assault. In the spring of 1521, Cortés was ready. He launched a full-scale siege of Tenochtitlan. His newly built warships, armed with cannons, gave him control of the lake, allowing him to blockade the city and cut off its supply of food and fresh water. His ground forces, swelled by tens of thousands of Tlaxcalan and other native allies, launched relentless attacks along the three major causeways leading into the city. The new Aztec emperor, the young and heroic Cuauhtémoc, led a desperate and valiant defense. For 80 days the city held out, with brutal house-to-house fighting. The siege was an apocalyptic struggle. The Spanish and their allies slowly, systematically, destroyed the magnificent city as they advanced. The defenders, weakened by starvation and disease, fought for every street and every canal with incredible bravery, but their situation was hopeless. On August 13, 1521, the last pocket of resistance collapsed and Cuauhtémoc was captured while trying to escape in a canoe. The great city of Tenochtitlan, the proud capital of the Aztec Empire, fell to the Spanish. On its ruins, Cortés would begin to build a new city, Mexico City, the capital of the new Spanish colony of New Spain. News of Cortez's incredible victory and the immense treasure he had seized in Mexico spread like wildfire among the Spanish colonies. It inspired a new generation of conquistadors to seek out other great empires to conquer. One such man was Francisco Pizarro, an aging and illiterate veteran from Extremadura. He was living in Panama, a tough and experienced soldier but one who had missed out on the great fortunes made in Mexico. For years he had heard persistent rumors from local natives about a fabulously wealthy kingdom far to the south, a land of mountains and gold they called Biru, which the Spanish corrupted into Peru. Pizarro, along with his partner Diego de Almagro and a priest, Hernando de Luque, formed a company to pursue this southern phantom. Their first two expeditions, launched in the 1520s, were miserable failures. They battled treacherous currents, dense jungles, hostile natives, and starvation. They found little evidence of the great empire they sought, and Pizarro's small band of followers was pushed to the brink of despair. On one occasion on the Isle of the Rooster, his men were on the verge of mutiny, demanding to return to Panama. Pizarro responded with a legendary act of defiance. He drew a line in the sand with his sword. Pointing south towards the unknown and the rumored riches of Peru, he said, "There lies Peru with its riches, here Panama and its poverty. Choose each man what best becomes a brave Castilian." Only 13 men, who became known as the famous 13, chose to cross the line and continue the desperate gamble with him. This small group pressed on and eventually encountered a trading raft from the Inca Empire, laden with fine textiles and precious metals. It was the first concrete proof they had that the legendary kingdom was real. With this evidence, Pizarro returned to Spain to seek a royal license for his conquest. In 1529, Pizarro had an audience with Queen Isabella of Portugal, the wife of King Charles I. He presented his case with the authority of a man who had seen the evidence firsthand. The Queen, impressed by his determination and the promise of a new empire even richer than Mexico, granted him the license he sought. He was named Governor and Captain General of Peru. He returned to his home region of Extremadura and recruited his 4 brothers and other hardy adventurers to join his cause. His long, patient gamble had finally paid off. He now had the royal authority and the manpower to attempt the conquest of the mighty Inca Empire. In 1532, Francisco Pizarro led a small force into the Inca Empire, which was weakened by civil war and disease. Atahualpa, secure in his power, met with the Spanish in Cajamarca. Pizarro set a deadly ambush, and when Atahualpa rejected the Spanish demands, Pizarro attacked. The Spanish slaughtered thousands and captured Atahualpa. He offered a ransom of gold and silver, but Pizarro betrayed him and had him executed, leaving the Inca Empire vulnerable. For most of the 16th century, Spain and Portugal pretty much had the world's oceans to themselves, their dominance secured by papal decree and their early lead in exploration. But the immense wealth they extracted from the Americas and the East did not go unnoticed. Other European nations, especially England and the Netherlands, began to challenge this Iberian monopoly. At first, they didn't really have the power to set up their own colonies, so they turned to a different strategy: piracy and privateering. They tried to bleed the Spanish and Portuguese empires of their wealth by attacking treasure fleets and raiding coastal settlements. England, under the Protestant Queen Elizabeth I, became Spain's most persistent rival. The English sea dogs, men like John Hawkins and his more famous cousin Francis Drake, were brilliant sailors and daring commanders. They were officially privateers, meaning they operated with the tacit approval and often a secret commission from the Queen, who shared in their profits. To the Spanish, though, they were nothing more than heretical pirates. Francis Drake became the most feared of them all, a real scourge of the Spanish Main. He plundered Spanish ports in the Caribbean and then sailed into the Pacific, a sea the Spanish considered their private lake, to attack their unsuspecting treasure ships. The Dutch, a small nation of merchants and seafarers, also emerged as a major maritime power. After gaining independence from Spain late in the 16th century, they were determined to break the Portuguese monopoly on the spice trade. They did this with a revolutionary new business model, the creation of the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC, in 1602. This wasn't a state-sponsored voyage but a publicly traded corporation, with the power to wage war, negotiate treaties, and establish colonies. The VOC aggressively and systematically pushed the Portuguese out of the Spice Islands, using its superior financial resources and naval power to set up its own, even more ruthless, monopoly. This new competition from the English and the Dutch fundamentally changed the nature of global exploration and expansion. The seas became a battleground for competing empires. Exploration was no longer just about finding new lands, it was about controlling trade routes, establishing strategic naval bases, and weakening rivals. The motivations were now less about religious conversion and more about commercial and national advantage. This fierce rivalry would fuel a new wave of exploration, not in search of gold or spices, but for something just as valuable: a northern passage to Asia that would bypass Spanish and Portuguese-controlled waters entirely. As rivalry with Spain intensified, English explorers sought a sea route to Asia, hoping for a northwest passage across North America. Francis Drake searched its western entrance, claiming California as New Albion. Others, like Martin Frobisher and John Davis, braved the Arctic, charting Baffin Island and the Davis Strait. Henry Hudson, seeking a northeast passage for the Dutch, instead crossed the Atlantic. He discovered the Hudson River and a deep-water harbor, leading to New Netherland and New Amsterdam. On his final voyage, Hudson discovered Hudson Bay, where his crew mutinied, leaving him to die in the icy waters. The Age of Discovery transformed humanity's understanding of the planet. The world went from isolated regions to a single knowable globe. Blank spaces were charted with coastlines and oceans. Columbus, da Gama, and Magellan discovered the world itself. This revolution shattered assumptions and challenged authority. The discovery of the Americas presented intellectual challenges. It opened doors to new thinking and human possibility. It was an age of wonder that stretched the boundaries of the known. The mental horizons of an entire civilization were expanded. Ultimately, the redrawn map symbolized a new relationship between humanity and the planet. Before the voyages of discovery, the world economy was fragmented. There were several large and vibrant trading zones: the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, the trans-Saharan routes, the Silk Road, but they were only loosely connected. The Great Leap into the oceans forged, for the first time in history, a truly global economic system. The sea lanes opened by Portuguese and Spanish ships became the arteries of a new worldwide marketplace, circulating goods, money, and people around the globe on an unprecedented scale. This new system fundamentally reordered the world's wealth and power, shifting the economic center of gravity from the East and the Mediterranean to the nations of the Atlantic coast. The initial driver of this new economy was the insatiable European demand for Asian spices. Vasco da Gama's voyage opened a direct sea route that allowed Portugal to bypass the old monopolies and seize control of the lucrative spice trade. But the discovery of the Americas soon introduced a new and even more powerful engine of global commerce: silver. The vast silver mines discovered by the Spanish in Peru, at places like Potosi, and in Mexico began to pump enormous quantities of precious metal into the world economy. This American silver flowed west to Asia to pay for spices and silks, and east to Europe to finance the ambitions and wars of the Spanish crown. This global network created new patterns of production and consumption. China, with its sophisticated economy and high demand for silver, became a massive sink for the wealth extracted from the Americas. In return, Chinese silks and porcelain flowed to markets in Manila and then on to Europe. Sugar, once a rare luxury, was transformed into a bulk commodity through the establishment of vast plantations in Brazil and the Caribbean, worked by enslaved African labor. These plantations were designed to produce a single cash crop for a distant European market, a model of colonial exploitation that would be replicated across the globe for centuries. This new world economy was not a partnership of equals. It was a system built on coercion and unequal exchange, designed to enrich the imperial centers of Europe at the expense of the colonial peripheries. The European powers used their military and technological advantages to control trade routes, dictate terms, and extract resources. This created a lasting global hierarchy, dividing the world into a core of manufacturing nations and a periphery of resource-supplying colonies. The economic structures established during the Age of Discovery, the plantation systems, the reliance on forced labor, the flow of raw materials from the colonies to Europe, would shape the global economic landscape for the next 500 years. The most profound and lasting legacy of the Age of Discovery was not economic or political, but biological. For millennia, the eastern and western hemispheres had existed in almost complete isolation, their ecosystems evolving on separate paths. The voyages of Columbus and those who followed initiated what historian Alfred Crosby termed the Columbian Exchange. a vast, intercontinental transfer of plants, animals, and microorganisms that would permanently remake the biology of the entire planet. This exchange was the most significant event in human history since the end of the Ice Age, with consequences both miraculous and catastrophic. From the Americas, the Old World received a host of revolutionary new food crops. The potato, originally from the Andes, became a staple food in Northern Europe, fueling a massive population boom. Maize, or corn, spread rapidly across Africa and parts of Asia, providing a hearty and high-yield source of calories. Tomatoes, peanuts, chili peppers, and cacao, the source of chocolate, transformed cuisines and diets around the world. These American crops became so widespread that today, it is difficult to imagine Italian food without tomatoes, or West African cuisine without peanuts and chili peppers. In the other direction, the Americas were inundated with species from the Eastern Hemisphere. European colonists brought their familiar crops, like wheat and grapes, and their livestock. Horses, which had been extinct in the Americas for thousands of years, revolutionized life for many Native American groups on the Great Plains, transforming them into nomadic buffalo hunters. Cattle and pigs, which reproduced at an astonishing rate, created a new ranching economy and drastically altered the landscape. The introduction of sugarcane led to the creation of the vast and brutal plantation system that would dominate the Caribbean and Brazil. This biological exchange was a two-edged sword. While it dramatically increased the world's food supply and enriched diets globally, it also had a devastating dark side. European ships carried unintentional passengers, weeds, pests, and most consequentially, diseases. The introduction of Old World pathogens like smallpox, measles, and influenza to the Americas, where indigenous populations had no evolved immunities, would trigger one of the greatest demographic disasters in human history. The Columbian Exchange connected the world, but for the original inhabitants of the Americas, this connection came at an almost unimaginable price. The story of the Age of Discovery, so often told as a heroic tale of European courage and adventure, is also a story of immense human suffering and cultural destruction. For the indigenous peoples of the Americas, Australia, and other parts of the globe, the arrival of European ships marked the beginning of a long and tragic era of conquest, displacement, and death. The discovery of these lands by Europeans was, for the people who already lived there, an invasion that would shatter their worlds, unravel their societies, and decimate their populations. The human cost of this global contact was staggering, and its legacy of trauma persists to this day. The military conquests, led by figures like Cortés and Pizarro, were characterized by shocking brutality. Small bands of conquistadors, leveraging their advantages in weaponry, tactics, and their alliances with rival native groups, were able to topple vast and sophisticated empires. The fall of Tenochtitlan and the destruction of the Inca Empire were not just military defeats, they were catastrophic cultural events that involved the massacre of elites, the looting of sacred sites, and the deliberate dismantling of ancient political and social structures. The conquerors saw the native civilizations not as something to be understood, but as something to be subdued and replaced. Beyond the initial violence of conquest, the establishment of colonial rule created systems of brutal exploitation. The Spanish implemented labor systems like the encomienda, which was essentially a form of serfdom, forcing native communities to work in mines and on plantations under horrific conditions. The relentless pursuit of silver and gold led to the deaths of millions in the hellish mines of Potosi and elsewhere. Across the Americas, indigenous peoples were stripped of their lands, forced into servitude, and subjected to a new legal and social order that relegated them to the lowest rungs of society. This physical subjugation was accompanied by a relentless assault on native cultures and beliefs. European missionaries, convinced of their own religious superiority, saw it as their duty to eradicate indigenous religions which they condemned as idolatry and devil worship. They burned sacred texts, destroyed temples and idols, and persecuted traditional spiritual leaders. While some missionaries genuinely sought to protect native peoples from the worst abuses of the colonists, their overall project was one of cultural replacement, not dialogue. The collision of worlds was, for the original inhabitants, a cataclysm that threatened not only their lives and their lands, but their very identity and soul. The Age of Discovery fundamentally reconfigured the global political landscape, giving rise to a new form of power, the maritime empire. For centuries, the world's great empires had been land-based, built on contiguous territories and large armies. The Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, English, and French now pioneered a new model, one based on sea power, long-distance trade, and a network of coastal forts, trading posts, and colonial settlements scattered across the globe. The key to power was no longer just control of land, but control of the oceans that connected the world's resources and markets. This marked the beginning of the era of European global dominance. Portugal was the first to build such an empire, a commercial network stretching from Brazil to Africa and across the Indian Ocean to the Spice Islands. It was an empire of trade routes and fortified ports, designed to monopolize the flow of valuable goods. Spain, in contrast, built a vast territorial empire in the Americas, conquering and settling huge land masses from Mexico to Peru. The immense wealth from its American silver mines made Spain the most powerful nation in Europe during the 16th century, funding its armies and its ambitions across the continent. These two Iberian powers were the world's first global superpowers. However, the Iberian monopoly did not last. The riches flowing from their empires attracted hungry rivals. In the 17th century, the Netherlands and England emerged as the next great maritime powers, challenging Spanish and Portuguese control. The Dutch, through their powerful East India Company, systematically dismantled the Portuguese trading empire in Asia, establishing their own, more efficient and ruthless monopoly over the spice trade. The English, through a combination of privateering, trade, and settlement, began to build their own empire, establishing colonies in North America and the Caribbean, and gaining a foothold in India. This competition between rival maritime empires became the central dynamic of world politics for the next 300 years. The oceans became a global chessboard where naval battles, colonial wars, and struggles for control of strategic ports and trade routes played out. Exploration continued, but its primary motive was now geopolitical: to find new resources, claim new territories, and gain an advantage over one's rivals. The New World Order forged during the Age of Discovery was one of intense and often violent competition between European states for global supremacy, a struggle whose consequences would shape the modern world. Among the most tragic and enduring legacies of the Age of Discovery was the creation and vast expansion of the transatlantic slave trade. While slavery had existed in various forms for millennia, the European push into the Atlantic transformed it into a massive, industrialized system of human trafficking based explicitly on race. The discovery of the Americas and the establishment of colonial economies, particularly the sugar plantations of Brazil and the Caribbean, created an insatiable demand for labor. When disease and brutal working conditions decimated the native populations, European colonists turned to Africa to find a new workforce to exploit. The Portuguese began this horrific trade in the 15th century, kidnapping or purchasing Africans and transporting them to work on sugar plantations on Atlantic islands like São Tomé. With the colonization of the Americas, this system exploded in scale. Over the course of nearly 4 centuries, from the early 1500s to the late 1800s, European ships forcibly transported an estimated 12.5 million African men, women, and children across the Atlantic, in what became known as the Middle Passage. It was the largest forced migration in human history, a journey of unimaginable cruelty and suffering where millions died from disease, abuse, and suicide. This trade formed one leg of the infamous triangular trade that was a cornerstone of the new Atlantic economy. European ships would sail to the coast of West Africa with manufactured goods like guns, cloth, and alcohol, which they would trade for enslaved people. Then came the horrific Middle Passage to the Americas, where the surviving Africans were sold for immense profits. The ships would then load up with the products of slave labor, sugar, molasses, tobacco, and cotton, and return to Europe. This brutal system generated enormous wealth for European merchants, ship owners and planters, and fueled the Industrial Revolution. The legacy of the transatlantic slave trade is deep and painful. It inflicted unimaginable trauma on the African continent, tearing apart societies, fomenting wars, and draining communities of their people for generations. In the Americas, it created societies fundamentally shaped by the institution of chattel slavery and the racist ideologies developed to justify it. The descendants of those who survived the Middle Passage continued to face centuries of oppression, violence, and systemic inequality. The shadow of the slave ship is long, and the struggle for racial justice and equality today is a direct and ongoing consequence of this dark chapter of global history. The vast movements of people set in motion by the Age of Discovery. Europeans, Africans, and Asians fundamentally and permanently reshaped the human landscape of the globe. In the Americas, the arrival of millions of European colonists and millions of enslaved Africans, combined with the catastrophic decline of the indigenous population, led to the creation of entirely new societies. This process, often violent and rooted in a rigid colonial hierarchy, nonetheless resulted in a complex mixing of peoples, cultures, and traditions on a scale never before seen. The world's human geography was being, irrevocably remixed. In Latin America, this mixing or mestizaje created a unique cultural blend. Spanish and Portuguese colonists, enslaved Africans, and surviving indigenous peoples intermingled, creating new hybrid populations and cultures. This fusion is visible everywhere, in the rhythms of the music, the spices in the food, the syncretic religious practices that blend Catholic saints with African and indigenous deities, and in the very faces of the people. While these societies were born from the trauma of conquest and slavery, they also represent a new and vibrant fusion of the old and new worlds, creating a cultural landscape distinct from any of its parent traditions. In North America, the pattern was often different, characterized more by displacement and segregation than by mixing. English, French, and Dutch colonization led to the establishment of settler societies that largely pushed indigenous peoples off their lands and onto reservations. Yet even here, a new and uniquely American culture emerged from the interaction of diverse European immigrant groups, African Americans, and Native Americans. The political ideals, languages, and social structures of these new nations were primarily European in origin, but they were adapted and transformed by the unique environment and challenges of the American continent. This legacy is written on our maps and in our languages. Cities from Los Angeles to Sao Paulo bear the names of European saints. The primary languages spoken in the Western Hemisphere are Spanish, Portuguese, English, and French, not Aztec or Inca. The dominant religions are forms of Christianity, but beneath this European overlay, the influence of Africa and the indigenous Americas remains powerful and resilient. The Age of Discovery set in motion a long and ongoing process of cultural negotiation, conflict, and creation, forging the diverse, multicultural, and often contentious societies that define so much of the modern world. Perhaps the most devastating and least intended legacy of the Age of Discovery was the unleashing of a biological holocaust. The European ships that connected the hemispheres were not just carrying people and cargo, they were carrying invisible armies of microbes. Diseases that had been endemic in Europe, Asia, and Africa for centuries, smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, bubonic plague, were introduced to the Americas, where the indigenous populations had no prior exposure and therefore no immunological resistance. The result was a demographic catastrophe of almost unimaginable proportions. Honestly, the greatest loss of life in human history. The impact of these virgin soil epidemics was swift and terrifying. Within a few generations of first contact, the indigenous population of the Americas collapsed, falling by an estimated 90% in many regions. Entire communities were wiped out. The great, densely populated empires of the Aztecs and Incas were hollowed out by disease even before the conquests were complete, a factor that critically weakened their ability to resist. The pandemic swept ahead of the Europeans themselves, so that explorers often marched into lands that were already depopulated and filled with the eerie silence of recent mass death. This demographic collapse had profound consequences that shaped the entire colonial project. It created the need in the minds of the colonists for a new labor source, directly fueling the expansion of the transatlantic slave trade to replace the dying native workforce. It also made the European conquest of the land far easier, creating vast, seemingly empty territories that settlers could claim and occupy. This emptiness was, of course, an illusion created by the recent pandemic. The myth of an untouched, virgin wilderness waiting for civilization was a convenient fiction that erased the memory of the millions who had lived there before. The exchange was not entirely one-sided. Syphilis appears to have been the one major disease that traveled from the Americas back to Europe, where it caused a terrifying epidemic in the late 15th and 16th centuries. But its impact, while significant, was minuscule compared to the devastation wrought by Old World diseases in the New. This great dying is a stark reminder that the most powerful force in the story of the European expansion was not guns or steel, but germs. It is a silent, tragic legacy that underscores the unpredictable and often catastrophic nature of connecting worlds that had been separate for so long. Ultimately, the Age of Discovery brought an end to the splendid isolation that had characterized the human condition for most of its history. For tens of thousands of years, different branches of the human family had spread across the globe, adapting to different environments and creating a rich tapestry of distinct cultures, languages, and civilizations. They lived in separate worlds, largely unaware of one another's existence. The voyages of the 15th and 16th centuries shattered this separation forever. They wove the scattered threads of regional histories into a single, tangled, and often contradictory global narrative. This new interconnectedness meant that for the first time, an event on one side of the planet could have profound and immediate consequences on the other. The discovery of a silver mountain in Peru could destabilize the currency of Ming China. The demand for sugar in England could determine the fate of millions of people in West Africa. A political rivalry between Spain and Portugal could lead to the drawing of a line on a map that would shape the destiny of the South American continent. Humanity was now living in a single global system, where the fortunes of all peoples were intertwined, whether they knew it or not. This process was undeniably driven by Europe and largely for the benefit of Europe. It was an age of expansion, not an age of equal encounter. European technology, ambitions, and diseases set the terms for this new global reality. This laid the foundation for a world order dominated by Western powers, a legacy that continues to shape international relations, economic inequalities, and cultural debates in the 21st century. The very concepts we use to understand the world, the division between East and West, the idea of discovery itself, are products of this Eurocentric era of history. Yet despite the profound inequalities of its creation, this new global framework also contained the seeds of a new human consciousness. By revealing the full diversity of human societies, it also revealed a common humanity. The challenges we face today, from climate change and pandemics to global economic crises, are all inherently global in nature, requiring a level of international cooperation that would have been unimaginable before the world was stitched together by the voyages of these early explorers. The end of isolation was a violent and traumatic birth, but it created the single shared world that all of humanity now inhabits. The Age of Discovery is not a remote, dusty period of history. It is the foundational event of the modern era, and its echoes reverberate powerfully in the world we live in today. The globalized economy, the food on our tables, the languages we speak, the political borders on our maps, and the very genetic makeup of populations are all direct consequences of the voyages that began over 500 years ago. To understand the present, we must understand the complex and often painful legacy of that transformative age, an age that brought humanity together in ways that were both creative and destructive. The immense inequalities that define our world, the persistent gap between the developed North and the developing South, have their roots in the colonial structures established during this period. The exploitation of resources, the imposition of unequal trade relationships, and the legacy of slavery and forced labor created patterns of wealth and poverty that have proven remarkably durable. The political instability and ethnic conflicts in many parts of the world can be traced back to the arbitrary borders drawn by colonial powers, which ignored existing cultural and tribal affiliations. The past is never truly past, it is present in our institutions and our struggles. At the same time, the cultural fusion and interconnectedness sparked by these voyages continue to enrich our world. We live in an era of unprecedented exchange where ideas, art, music, and information can circle the globe in an instant. The multicultural societies that were forged in the crucible of colonial encounter, while often fraught with tension, are also sources of incredible dynamism and innovation. The story of discovery reminds us that our world has always been shaped by migration, interaction, and the blending of different peoples and traditions. Therefore, we are all heirs to the Age of Discovery. We inherit its triumphs and its tragedies, its moments of brilliant connection and its moments of brutal conquest. The story of Columbus, da Gama, Magellan, and all the others is not just a tale of adventure on the high seas. It is the story of the birth of our modern, interconnected world, with all its promise and all its problems. By confronting this complex legacy with honesty and empathy, we can better understand the forces that have shaped our present, and perhaps, just maybe, navigate more wisely into the shared future of the one world they